Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are, welcome to Biotechgate Digital Partnering and to today's investor session. My name is Joost Strenkley. I am the COO and the partner of Venture Valuation. We are the company who is actually running Biotechgate Digital Partnering. This is already the 10th edition of Biotechgate Digital Partnering, and we are delighted to have again over 1,000 participants from all over the world who participate in this conference. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all our sponsors and partners for their great support, and a special thanks goes to Christian from Broadreach Global, who organized again a very interesting series of sessions and panel discussions which will take place during this Digital Partnering Week. Before we start, I would like to inform you that we will record this workshop and make it available in the media center in the partnering system. The title of this session is Investing in Brain Health Innovation, and I'm really looking forward to hear what our panel of experienced experts and investors will tell us about this topic, especially in these politically and economically rather uncertain times. With that, I would say let's get it started, and I'm happy to hand over to you, Christian.
Well, thank you, Joost, for a great introduction as always. And it's always a pleasure to do these meetings with Biotechgate Digital Partnering. I think you guys have been doing in-person partnering for almost 20 years now and helped pioneer this in the biotech and health space. And as we were discussing, it was always interesting to see if these online meetings and partnering would continue even after COVID. So it is nice to see that we're still getting record numbers of participants for the partnering. And it looks like we're getting a pretty good turnout for the sessions as well, even though this one was added pretty recently. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just very briefly share a slide on my screen because I want the participants to understand. Let me see if I can share that. Oh, Joost, can I share a screen? If you or Connor can enable that, just briefly, and then I'll go back.
Should actually be possible. Maybe Connor, you can quickly check.
Yeah. Well, anyway, what I was going to say is the idea here, and we have some great panelists, is to give the participants a sense of the in-person meeting we did in Lisbon in October, which will happen again as a larger meeting in person in October again. And Biotechgate was, of course, the partnering partner for that, so a strategic partner. Guys, just very briefly, you can see this meeting. We hosted the Neuro, Digital, and AI Innovation Summit in Lisbon. That's the venue in the background. Absolutely gorgeous view of Lisbon right on the waterfront. It was hosted by the Champalimaud Foundation with the support of the European Brain Council, who I work with quite closely, and supported by partners like Biotechgate Digital Partnering, but also Cambridge Cognition, Medable, the Applied Neuroscience Association, the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, the Brain Capital Alliance, and many others. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I just wanted to show you because you're all invited to join us next year. And we're going to pick up in a few sessions this week, starting today with the investor session, which I'll introduce the panel in a moment, with a couple of sessions, talks, and panels to give you a taste of what we addressed in person. There's always a different feel in person, but I think we can get a lot of it online, and I know a lot of you are looking forward to this. So if I can ask Julia, Joshua, and Karl to all come on video and on camera, I'm going to introduce our panel. It's good to see you guys. Small, maybe I better put my reading glasses back on. Getting older, so with the small images, this helps. So this panel is a group of investors and an investment banker. We've lost one, and I have to say this is my fault. Eduardo is a Brazilian VC investing in South America. and it is a Brazil World Cup match right now. So he was very apologetic, but he promises to make it up in future, but I'm not going to hold that one against him. I think I can understand, and I'm sure many of you can as well. So we have questions coming in. As they come in, please let me know, and I will answer them. I will also provide my email for those of you that want to reach out to me, or you can find me on LinkedIn and message me there, because I see we already have 1 or 2 questions. So this is an investor session and a banker session really on investment in neurodigital health, or digital health for neurosciences and brain health and mental health and wellness, right, across the board. I'm going to start. We have 3 speakers, 3 panelists today. We have Julia Prakapovich from Interface Fund. And Julia, I'll come back to you for a proper introduction in a moment. We have Joshua Haynes from Masawa. And Joshua, I'm going to ask you to introduce your fund because it's rather unique. And we have Karl Hess out of Outcome Capital, an investment bank in Boston. And Karl, if I'm correct, is the managing director for MedTech and digital health and has a strong interest in the applications for neuro and the brain space. So Julia, going both left to right as I see the photos here, and ladies first, I'm going to ask you if you can introduce yourself, briefly your own background, and then Interface Fund. And then we'll go on and we'll talk to Karl and Joshua.
Sure, sounds great. Thank you, Christian. I'm Julia Prakapovich, and I'm general partner at Interface Fund. In past, I was a co-founder of a digital healthcare startup and also a partner of a growth stage fund out of San Francisco. An Interface Fund is a 20 million pre-seed seed deep tech fund at the intersection of physics and biology. So we look at fundamental tech enabling platforms in human tech, synthetic biology, bioengineering, and new computing. So neural interfaces and neurotech is one of the core area for us.
Well, thanks so much, Julia. And I think it's worth mentioning to the audience that you and I met actually through an introduction by one of your portfolio company CEOs, which was usually the opposite of the way this works, but good networking is good networking. So thanks for being here, Julia. I guess, Karl, let's go to you because you're the one non-investor here, but you're clearly dealing with fundraising in this space on a regular basis. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and then about Outcome Capital briefly so people understand the perspective you're speaking from?
Sure, Christian. Thanks for organizing this. I know it was a lot of behind the scenes efforts to get this on the book. So thanks for that. And thanks and welcome all. Sure. So my background is a bit of life sciences early on, bench researcher, and then moving in a more commercial direction, and then consulting for about a 5-year stint where I got to consult for about half of the top 20 global pharma companies, about half of the top 20 global medical device companies. And towards the tail end of that, I ran across my first mobile health company and have kind of been in that space, the digital space, population health management space ever since, including the last couple of roles I had before coming to Outcome Capital as CEO of one, a tech-enabled provider organization that was taking full risk in the frail and vulnerable space. And then secondly, a CEO of small commercial health plan in the US and in North Texas. And Outcome Capital is a unique and highly specialized healthcare and life sciences advisory firm and investment bank. And this is neuro, just in general, is one of the areas that I've kind of landed on to learn more about over time and certainly have an interest in, because I think we're just really getting started with a lot of the things having to do with neuroscience.
Thanks, Karl. And I think you provided a nice intro for a few of my questions, so I'll come back to that one. And I fully agree. It's a very interesting time at the intersection of digital health, AI, technology, and the neuro space broadly defined. And I'm going to say to the audience, when I am saying neuro or neurosciences, I'm not saying neurology to the exclusion of psychiatry or mental health. I'm using this as a broad basket term, and I understand that may be a little controversial, but from the perspective I'm speaking of, many of these indications, disorders, and conditions can be addressed equally well by digital health in both spaces. They are different markets, but they're also related markets. And on that note, Joshua, can you tell us about yourself and Masawa?
Sure, my pleasure. And thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be here. Despite it being digital, it was wonderful to be in Lisbon, of course, and that building is quite amazing. So I hope to see you all there next year in October as well. I'm Joshua Haynes, the founding partner of Masawa, the Mental Wellness Impact Fund. Before getting into the Impact Mental Wellness Fund, I ran a large social impact fund for the US and the Swedish government, investing about $200 million in areas around startups, enterprises, technology, civil society, human rights, the whole gamut. At Masawa, we're raising what we think is the first mental wellness impact fund. We're focusing on investing in founders catalyzing mental wellness. So our range is looking at everything from illness to wellness, from languishing to flourishing. But we put a social impact kind of tent on it. For us, it's important that we're not just writing checks to early stage founders. It's important that we're also nurturing that capital. So by ensuring that we are looking at founders' own well-being, their own leadership effectiveness, organizational health, and helping them to not burn out and therefore lose the number of companies in our portfolio, we are essentially focusing on maximizing, sure, financial returns, but also the social impact of the outcomes that are being done through the products and services of the companies we're investing in. Thanks.
Thanks, Joshua. And I think that's a really interesting space. And I think we're going to see more and more social impact investing in the brain space and in other health areas where we haven't seen it. Frankly, we may have seen it more in the population health space. And Karl alluded to this, if not to the social impact investing, but we're seeing it now. In fact, I'm working on a project in development with one of our other speakers from Lisbon, Juan Carlos Lopez, who for many years was the managing chief editor of Nature Medicine, and before that, the founding editor of Nature Reviews Neuroscience. He's now funding micro trials for rare diseases, and we're focused on a new project looking at innovative financing models for rare diseases, starting with the brain space, but not exclusively. That just is a very good area to start with for a number of reasons. On this, I'm going to ask a general question to the panel, and I think you might all have similar answers, but coming from a different perspective. Karl, you mentioned that the neurosciences, the brain, is an interesting area from the digital health perspective, the market perspective. I want to throw this out to the panel broadly because I think you're all coming at this at a similar time, from different backgrounds, but we're all seeing, and this is part of why we did this broad meeting in Lisbon, trying to tie in all the different perspectives around neuro and digital and AI. Right, whether it is precision medicine for pharma, or whether it's virtual reality or cognitive behavioral therapy, there is so much going on right now. Can we talk about why there is that interest? One, in the market, and then maybe two, from the investor perspective or the finance perspective. Karl, and you're raising money, you're not directly investing it. I'm not picking one of you. This is a broader and trickier question. I don't think there's a wrong answer, but whoever wants to go first, please go ahead.
I'll take a stab, Kristen. I think one of the areas certainly is that our capabilities with regard to technology have reached a certain threshold level where some new things are possible, new data sources, and certainly amounts of data that can be processed. And all of that has changed very rapidly over the last 5 years or so. And so I think there's this confluence of, stakeholder perspectives that are all kind of focused on the brain, if you will. And so you mentioned a few of those, and I would add to that list, we're learning things about the brain because of COVID. It's a driver for some areas of research, particularly long COVID and some of the lasting impacts. From a therapeutic standpoint, if we think about neurotropics and psychotropics, we're learning things about the brain from that perspective. We are able to handle and process, particularly with the use of machine learning and AI, unprecedented amounts of data with regard to imaging and other types of mapping and sequencing and things like that. So this confluence of things that has us learning about the brain and new functions, and now the approximate 1,000 different cell types in the brain, we're getting to that next level of detail. And there's some global initiatives also that are ongoing right now that have large amount of, multi-100 million or even billion-dollar funding that are also investigating this area. And so I feel like this confluence of things is really allow us to kind of get to that next level of understanding.
Thanks, Karl. And yeah, when we were thinking of a name for the initiative where we wanted to tie things together, one of the terms we used was confluence and confluence innovation for exactly the reasons that you're mentioning. Maybe not the most common term, but I think in this case, it makes a lot of sense. I want to take this to Julia and then to Joshua, and maybe Julia, you mentioned, the intersection of physics and biology, right? So this is what you're doing in terms of the shifting technologies and the better understanding of biomarkers and the greater amount of data and the ability to process this with machine learning and AI. Are these the areas that you see driving this market from a technology perspective? And then I want to come to Joshua also from the let's say the market need on the medical health side, but we'll come back to all of you on that. But I think the driver there will be a little different.
Right. So we are a deep tech investor. We look only at a certain breakthrough, a scientific breakthrough in physics that are used in living organisms. So like, for instance, we look at wireless, new form of power delivery in wireless brain-machine interface devices. And I would say from the deep tech perspective, we see the field, it's usually a scientific breakthrough that comes first and that leads to certain applications. So I would say from our perspective, we see the main driver in neuroscience field is in this scientific breakthrough that was never happened before. And at a certain point, we reach out the technology development that allow us to discover completely new areas, whether that's, as I mentioned, wireless power delivery, or it's a new form of brain-machine interfaces delivery in general, like blood vessel delivery. So I see that coming from the scientific breakthrough first, but definitely there are different perspectives on AI and machine learning that leads to that as well.
Okay, and I think you've given us some points to come back to as well. So thank you for that, Julia. And Joshua, obviously Masawa has a slightly different approach, but I think you're seeing some of the same trends. And Karl had mentioned, the focus or the spotlight that COVID put on mental health, which we can say this is a problem that's always been there and been under-resourced and underserved, but how important was COVID and, for the sector and also for yourself in the thinking to launch Masawa?
Sure. Well, I think Karl and both Julia are spot on in terms of the innovations and technologies that we see. And I think there's also been a decrease in the amount of stigma specifically around mental health issues, whether it be depression, anxiety, eating disorders, suicide, dementia, et cetera. We've all been through COVID, dealt with something additionally that we might not have wanted to admit before. And people are now looking for solutions, especially younger people that are generations, Gen Z generation specifically is very apt to speaking about their mental health freely and openly, and not just in the United States, but in many countries and many cultures around the world. And so we see that there is now a demand for mental health services, but there's not the matching supply, especially with the traditional healthcare delivery methodologies. And so we see a unique opportunity to increase or to invest in companies that are increasing access and efficiencies, and not only driving the innovation paradigms as well.
Okay, I think some very good points there, and absolutely very interesting. And yeah, I think you're right. Younger people in the US, but also internationally, are more open to this, and maybe also more comfortable with the technology and the interface. And on Thursday, for those of you really interested in mental health as well, we'll have a different session, not on investing, but talking on digital delivery of care and digital health for mental health specifically. And we're going to touch on the health equity gap there, right? The underserved sectors of the population. And this comes to a population health perspective as well, but youth may be very open to this, but until now, it's a market which has been underserved in terms of mental health care. So I think if you're finding an opportunity to invest there, it's great. I see we have a question coming up from Naomi. So guys, this is a great reminder, all of you in the audience, if you have a question, just type it. We'll either answer it live or we will at least type an answer. And if you really have something to say, just give us a ping. Maybe we'll promote you to panelist if I have ability to do that, but we'll certainly take your question. So Naomi asks, the Neurodigital and AI Summit was a remarkable event, and I hope many of the delegates will be able to join us there next year. Thank you, Naomi. The leading global causes of death and disability are neurological, Alzheimer's and other dementias, mental ill health, and as you mentioned, COVID has worsened each of these. What do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities for applying neuroscience research to solve real-world challenges? Anybody want to take that?
I can take that.
Okay.
So I would say we saw the whole decade of research coming from the small molecules towards neurodegenerative diseases. And we saw that failed at the point where pharma companies had to pull off and shut down certain neuroscience divisions. So again, if I'm coming from deep tech and I see that we have a next generation of potential breakthrough that allow us to rediscover this therapeutic areas, but from the different point, from the point of neuromodulation or neurostimulation, or we will potentially create a new form of diagnostic of the disease as well. There are definitely great potential of a new technologies in curing this neurodegenerative disease.
Okay, thanks, Julia. And I think you're absolutely right there. And it is interesting what we've seen with pharma. They basically wound down neuroscience and CNS, and before that they wound down psychiatry. And then the past 2 years, we've really seen an upswing in the pharma focus on CNS and neuroscience. And a lot of this was digitally driven by biomarkers and the ability to measure outcomes. And I think I saw Nick from Cambridge Cognition was on board. So companies like Cambridge Cognition providing tools to enable measuring outcomes that could never be measured at an accurate level to the point that regulators would accept it as a clinical endpoint. So things have changed. And then, as you said, the ability to handle the data. Karl, from a population health perspective, because you have some background here, I'm going to ask you the same question. What do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for applying neuroscience research to solve real-world challenges?
Well, on the the diagnosed condition forefront of research and opportunity perspective, with the ability to talk about it, I think in greater detail, and there's that ability then to have a conversation about the ideas in the space, the technology in the space, the capabilities in the space, the treatments in the space, the outcomes in the space, and so that's a rising tide lifts all boats, phenomenon that we've experienced, particularly, again, accelerated by COVID. And so that's one of the large opportunities, I think, is just to have the conversations. One of the challenges I feel is still on the funding side. And so while we saw a good, uptick in terms of funding, a few quarters ago with regard to mental and behavioral health in particular, that, then has gone down along with funding in some other spaces. Yeah, declined fairly dramatically, right? And so year over year, approximately. And so I think that's a challenge. Still, do people get tired of talking about this? I hope not, because it's been, so traditionally underserved that, we still have so much to do. And so I feel that, we have to continue to have these conversations. And I hope that, people aren't getting tired of this, because the need is still there, right? From a market perspective, from a research perspective, all the way around. And so from a funding perspective as well.
I think that's incredibly important, and the ability to make an impact is there, probably in a way it wasn't even 5 years ago, right? If we talk about some of the innovations and breakthroughs that we've seen. So Karl, I want to come back to that point because it's a really key one, and it's part of what we focused on in Lisbon. But I want to go to Joshua first. Before I do that, there's a question from Be Mindful. A foundation has created a free online applied neuroscience course for well-being to remove barriers to access, and they're looking for donors. So be mindful. I'm not sure who you are. Please reach out to me by email or on LinkedIn direct message, and we can have an offline chat. We'll see, maybe the European Brain Foundation can help with this, and maybe there's something else we can do. I don't want to go too far off topic for this panel, but I think that is an interesting one. And for those of you looking for a free online resource, Be Mindful might be one you want to take a look at. So Joshua, when you're looking at mental health from a social impact perspective, right, where are the areas where you see the most interesting opportunities to make an impact, so social impact? So where are you going to concentrate, let's say, some of your shots on goal to do, and we'll come back to what's happening to the funding, because this is not just digital health, it's not just neuro digital health, and it's also in the CNS and neuropsychiatric space in terms of investment as well, which is really interesting because the potential is getting better and the problems are bigger. But let's come back to that in a minute. But Joshua, where are you looking to make an impact? What do you think are the most interesting opportunities on the mental health side?
Sure. So we, as an impact fund, are accountable not only for the financial return for our investors, but also for the social return. So half of our carried interest of our performance fee is actually tied directly to social outcomes that are measured when a liquidation happens. And so as such, our overarching indicator is the number of people with increased mental wellness. So we're looking at how do we increase access to different types of populations, whether it be age. Children is a huge focus, of course, because we know that 50% of mental illness starts before the age of 14, or their issues triggered by events happening before the age of 14. And then on the converse side, of course, with parents. And in terms of specifically, so access is the big one. Second one for us is efficiency. Existing system of some supply and demand of care provider and patients is oftentimes broken for a number of reasons, and not just in countries like Germany, which has a socialized medical system where I live, but it's broken across the board. And so how do we invest in those companies that are making the existing system, helping to reduce those supply issues, using technology-based artificial intelligence, using community-based approaches, which is crucial. And then the final area that we are most excited about is innovation. Yes, brain-computer interface, BCIs, computational neuroscience, a lot of the deep tech areas that are new and upcoming. But what about the old things that have been around, like plant medicine for centuries? And so I think in terms of maximizing that impact, these are the three areas that we're looking at specifically. I wanted to quickly come back to that last question and kind of give around the challenges of how do you get research out of the lab or the university. I think there are a couple of structural problems that we see. One, especially in Europe, where I'm based and focused, is it's difficult for spin-offs, so companies that are founded at universities, to spin off cleanly, and that the founders still have the ability to, without being diluted after a couple of rounds to the point of not having control, be able to drive their innovations forward. In Germany, we also have a huge problem of ESOP issues, where employees or early joiners to the startups get part of the company. And so these are a couple of different things that are quite challenging. But on the other side, the amount of companies that we see now that have non-dilutive grants and are looking at non-dilutive grants and funding from the public sector is quite large, not only in Germany, but across Europe. And of course, in the US as well. And so those are some amazing opportunities to be able to pull it out of this research in order to make the impact that we need. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. I think really good points. And yeah, I'm not sure if I introed this, but some of the audience who know me know I spent a decade running a program to help university and institute technology transfer and licensing offices better engage with industry, with health systems, with investors, and be better partners for them, in fact, but be better able to move their assets or their technologies forward. You raised some important issues, and I want to come back to these as well, right? Because it involves how innovation is funded in the US and in Europe, and it's not always, the same in terms of the tranches and the amount of funding and the milestones, and that brings pros and cons, on both sides. And the rest of the world will be closer to one or the other, or maybe China will have its own approach. But let's come back to what Karl was mentioning. And Karl, as a banker, I think you're looking at this. Julia and Joshua, you're probably looking at it more from what's happening in your space with investments. But investments did in the neurospace go off a cliff 2 quarters back, right? After seeing a few 2 years of growth. And on the digital sort of CNS side, it was maybe more mental health driven, mental health and wellness. But on the biopharma side, it was dementia driven, CNS, dementia, neurodegeneration. And even as one of the top investors in Europe in the space, Philip Sheltons, who's a KOL neurologist and clinician in Amsterdam, put it to me about 1.5 years ago. He said, this is a golden era, and now we have the potential to do truly rational drug development in CNS for the first time. Really, that's how he phrased it, right? And that is true. And there have not been that many massive failures, and there have been successes. But even on the pharma side, right, on the biopharma side, the funding went off a cliff, took a bit of a nosedive in the CNS and neurosciences compared to other areas of biopharma investment. And then we see the brain space taking a bit of a dive on the digital side, when by all measures, this space should be more interesting and promising than it ever has been in the past. Now, on the pharma side, there's still risk. There's no question. On the digital side, we're seeing large, well-funded companies that did, 80 or $100 million Series A's in the mental health space. Companies like Mindstrong, they're still there because they have the money, but they have had business model challenges and treatment paradigm challenges where the data did not pan out the way they expected. And these are some of the questions I asked in Lisbon. I don't know the answers. I'm going to say this very clearly to everybody watching here, but I think these are questions worth asking. What is happening? Let's concentrate more on the digital and technology side of neuro and mental health. Are there challenges that would explain the slowdown in investment in this space? Is it somehow cyclical in this part of the digital health market, whether digital therapies or behavioral therapy, or is there something else that we don't know that's happening? Because I look at it, I see the potential being better than it ever was before, and I don't see major problems that should cause the investor market to back off. Am I missing something? Or let's see, what are you looking at? What are the areas that concern you? You're obviously all committed to this space, but what are the challenges that you see? Again, that's a tough one. I haven't picked anybody, but I will if it takes too long.
Yeah, I can take it.
Thanks, Julia.
I think I wouldn't be the best person to talk from the digital healthcare perspective, but in general, we see the whole investment sector falling off the cliff because of the recession and all macroeconomics. I would say the only industry that was behaving more recession-proof is the deep tech, but the rest, including the whole healthcare sector, was performing much worse. And so the less influx of capital comparing to other quarters and other years as well. with that said, I don't think that will last long from my perspective. We saw other recessions before, and probably it's more macroeconomics rather than specific pullback from neuroscience itself.
Okay, thanks. Karl?
I don't have an answer, but I have a hypothesis, Christian, and that might be that a lot of the investors are looking for some of the initial investments in the space, particularly the mental health side and the digital side, to pay off. And so how can all of these companies, some which are very niche focused, scale and grow when there are a fair number, let's say 50 to 100 plus, even well-funded companies in the United States that are providing, for example, mental telehealth or, mental telemedicine, mental health focused telemedicine. And so I think they're waiting for, the business model issues to be worked out. Some of those companies that have been well funded, as you alluded to, had kind of fallen back on relying on writing prescriptions. And there was definitely some market forces push back on that, and some compliance issues. And so with that, I think what's been talked about a lot, and I've written about it a little bit over the past year, is the customer acquisition cost is one of these more direct to the consumer, considerations, right? And so that had been over time, particularly with the buildup in funding and the economy, gotten more expensive over time. And so those DTC models, they either have to pivot, they have to partner with another entity, an employer, or potentially a provider, or a payer, to get to market. And there's a lot of inefficiencies in that process with so many companies. There's a certain level of noise, and it's hard for individual companies to kind of rise above that level of noise to get the attention that their solution they're offering may very well deserve. That's a hypothesis I have, that there's some waiting on the sidelines to see what pans out, how some of these business models scale and how successful they can be over time, and what some of those metrics are in terms of outcomes.
So thank you, Karl. I mean, those are really interesting points. And I think some of the problems aren't new. I can say 9 years ago, almost 10 years ago now, I was involved in launching migraine digital therapeutics, which became a clinician tool company, right? And clinicians loved it. It's got excellent uptake on that side. Business model, isn't quite the blockbuster that we expected, but the engagement with health systems, right, with payers, with self-insured employers, even 9, 10, 8 years ago, they were swamped. They were seeing 5 or 10 different proposals a week from companies with very interesting solutions, right? And now I hear at the health systems and the hospital networks, they're seeing 20 a day, right? If you talk to the relevant people there. So the path to market is complex. And if you're going B2C customer acquisition, you're an app, you're in the store, it may not require, there may be a consumer side and not maybe more of a wellness side. There's a revenue model there, but how do you scale? The path into health systems in Germany, there are paths, for innovative solutions, and in the UK and certain other national single payer systems. But you may not be able to scale with 20,000 or 30,000 patients in a small regional health system if the margins are low. And one of the speakers we had in Lisbon was Andy Keller, who's the CEO of the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. And he mentioned that in Texas, because it's such a large state, they can potentially help companies get into several 100,000 or 1 million plus patients, where the smaller margins might be sufficient with a larger population. Is this part of the challenge? And do companies need to look earlier on at what their business model is in terms of what the possible margins are and what is a path to market that can generate viable returns for them? And I want to ask this also to Julia and Joshua, because this is very challenging for an early stage company. There's all these potential applications, right? And you need the first use case somewhere. but getting that first hospital or health system on board, or even that first large employer, self-insured employer in the US, who you would assume has a real vested interest in reducing their healthcare costs and improving employee wellness, it's not easy, right? So how do they sort of road test their path to market and their distribution channels early on, and get a sense of, are these viable, or do we have to rethink them? Because I think it's really easy to see things that make sense, but when the rubber hits the road, they may not be as viable as we assumed, not because it doesn't make sense, but because getting it done is very, very challenging. Is that a fair question? I have some experience in this space, but it's limited. So, I want to defer to your views on this. Even if it's a hypothesis, I think that's a much better starting place than just looking at the sector and trying to figure out what's going on.
If I might start, I have some observations of what we're seeing. I think the hypothesis is correct, but it also is very geography specific. In Germany, for example, we see and have been quite surprised by the number of pre-seed companies who are already have agreements with some of the top insurers in the country, because these insurers, they're also getting scared of the neo insurers coming in, innovation happening outside of them, and they also know that they need to eventually diversify their product set, so that in 7-8 years they are also potentially acquiring different companies, and so they're already partnering with very young startups. Which now there's issues of contract agreements and what are the specific terms, making sure that there's exclusivity and a number of other things that we need to look at, of course. But it hasn't. Sorry, my son just came in. This is Ellis. Hi, everybody. So that's something specifically for Germany that we've seen, which is exciting, I must say.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting, and I think Germany probably has the most accessible sort of path to market, at least for piloting innovative technologies with health systems of any European country, and potentially globally. Although I can't be certain of that, but having spent most of my career in Europe, I know the UK has some very good opportunities. Spain has some. France is getting around to some, and in Scandinavia there are some. But Germany's clearly been out front in this space for a long while, and it's why many European companies go for a CE mark in Germany first, so that they can get into some of these reimbursement programs. But Julia, do you tend to look at these, or from the deep tech side, are you? This is maybe a very naive question, right? I assume you look at the technology and the market, right? But how would you say that breaks down when you're doing earlier stage investments? How much of the emphasis are you putting on the technology and the solution versus the challenges of the market and business model?
I would say we look at the pre-seed and seed, we look primarily at technology, its potential, and the team, because team is the key point of whether they'll be able to find go-to-market strategy. The problem with the pre-seed companies, especially in a highly innovative spaces, is exactly what you mentioned. They may not find the right path straight away. So we just look at whether the team could be flexible enough to pivot if necessary. And it's better to, especially that's probably more US pre-seed approach, it's better to fail faster and rearrange the whole company and find a new go-to-market strategy than just to keep the same strategy and trying to push it through. Because especially in deep tech space, sometimes you can be surprised how companies pitch in one thing at the pre-seed and they pivot into completely different strategy by Series A.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Karl, you're obviously advising companies. I'll come back in a few minutes to the stage of the companies you're advising and so forth, and also with regard to investments for Julia and Joshua. But Karl, how do you see these issues, and how can companies get a sense of where they're going? Because obviously we're starting with, is there a medical need, right? Or a health and wellness need? And is there a possible solution? And then we figure out, what is the model to deliver that? And that seems to be where not all, but many of the challenges are, right? Sometimes the idea is we think we're going to get enough data, and it's gonna support the interventions or the solutions or the approaches that we're proposing, and it doesn't always work out that way. And that's just, you don't know until you have the data, right? Even if everybody believes this, and I've seen many companies run into this challenge, and I've been on the other side of it as well. But how do we road test the business proposition early on? Because as we scale, especially in Europe, you can get some seed or a small Series A. In the US, the Series A's may be bigger. They may be, not just 3 or 5. They may, in some cases, be 50 or 100 million, and even in digital health, and they may be 800 million, like with resilience in biomanufacturing, right? Although that is an outlier. Let's be clear. But how does an early stage company that doesn't have too much money, but they've identified a problem, the key stakeholders are on board, they have a technology solution which could really potentially make an impact? How do you get a sense of where the business model challenges are going to be, and how do we address those? And could be a funding risk, that's one thing, right? But it could also be a market or a customer acquisition risk, or a channel risk. I assume you spend much more time on these things than I do. So what would be your, how do you look at this when a company comes to you?
There's a lot to unpack there, Kristen, but I'll try
with my questions, they tend to be long and touch on several things. So the solution is to answer the part of it that you like. And if you didn't like the question, just answer something else. I'm okay with that.
No, it's good. I appreciate that. The guidance there. You know what? It's hard. Won't pretend that it's easy, and particularly in our current, macroeconomic conditions, right? And so it's particularly hard this year, and we'll see what happens next year. But it's a mixture. I mean, it requires you to be flexible, adaptable, and to persevere. And so you have to be able to do all of those things at different times. And so you have to have a strategy. You have to have an alternative, I think, use case and backup business model, or kind of a next offering, if you will, if things don't work out. And so that all has to be kind of pre-planned. And then going to market, we're telling companies to be very creative these days in how they do that. And so you'll see a lot of the funding announcements that are coincide with some favorable news and press release, some outcome or new partnership or something like that, new contract. Companies have to be creative about their messaging to the market in advance, kind of pave the way to a market launch or new market entry. And so there's a lot of opportunity to think creatively. I also feel in these economic conditions, for those companies that have cash in the bank, so to speak, and have a runway, they need to be thinking very strategically and sometimes aggressively about leapfrogging competition in terms of the current market conditions. And so that may mean M&A, and so being acquisitive and leveraging an inorganic growth strategy and kind of maximizing the potential on that side. And so how can you acquire more customers, more reach, broader impact and scale most quickly and most efficiently? And sometimes that might be the answer. And so it's all of those things, short answer.
So thank you, Karl. And I think that's really interesting because, on the biopharma side, having worked with a lot of universities and institutes around the world, and their technologies available for licensing or spin out, and then having worked with a number of serial founders who have had multiple exits, what we tend to see is that the one piece of IP from one lab or one group or one institute, even if it's a portfolio of complementary IP, on its own doesn't tend to be the value generator. You tend to need to aggregate and find the missing pieces somewhere else. And a lot of early stage companies don't do this because they're so in love with their own technology, which may be absolutely wonderful, by the way, right? But we see the stakeholders that, take a piece from, UC Santa Barbara, and then they pull something out of an institute in Germany. Then they pull something out of a university or a startup in Australia. And now they have something where all of a sudden, several years later, that company is going to IPO on NASDAQ, right? I'm making up the institutions in those in that particular combination, but I'm thinking of actual cases in each of those, right? I'm just sort of conflating a few of them here to not give away somebody else's story. But on the digital side, why don't we see more of that? If I look in Europe, there are brilliant companies, and I assume it's the same case in Asia and Australia and Latin America. And I do business in all of those places, but I'm much more familiar with the startup scene in Europe and the US than I am the rest of the world. But we see wonderful companies in Europe financed with, 500,000, 2 million euros, and they're getting really interesting data, and they've got something. And then we're seeing a US company with 20, 30 million in financing. Right. And I don't tend to see much discussion around the potential licensing or collaboration or M&A, even when the smaller company may be facing a funding gap. And they don't tend to be that open to being acquired, right, or to a merger. And the companies with the money don't tend to be that open to acquiring other complementary technology, which would strengthen their offering across the board. Why is that? Is that cultural? Is that the mindset of the entrepreneur innovator who developed the technology? Is there a need for some external perspective here? Is there a need for the investors to give them a gentle nudge sometimes? Recognizing that investors don't always know the technology better than the technology developers themselves, right? So I realize this is a delicate question, but how do we deal with this?
I think I have my probable answer, so it's more theory. I think there is a time lag. I see the other industries, and I was a partner at a generalistic fund before, so I see other industries already starting to do this. So they acquire companies in Europe and other regions in order to merge into one bigger offering, both from the strategic perspective of expanding the product and expanding geography. Mm-hmm. So it's already happening in other industries. We see that in fintech, we saw that in science enterprise and other fields as well. And I believe healthcare was a little bit behind comparing to the other industries in many senses. So maybe that will come to healthcare quite soon as well.
Thanks, Julia. I think that makes sense. But I think it's good to hear it from your perspective as an investor. Joshua, any thoughts on this? Because you're funding, of course, the earlier stage smaller companies in Europe primarily, right? So how do you think about that? I don't want to suggest that investors should dictate to their companies, but how do we ensure, because you want the founders fully committed and on board and actively engaged in running the business, right? Otherwise, you don't have a team. And as Julia highlighted early on, the team is crucial. But how do we encourage this sort of market and business model thinking in an earlier stage company? And then Karl, I want to come back to you and ask, how do we encourage it in the better funded companies who, and I understand there's a vested interest from the investment bank side. You'd like to run some of those acquisitions for them, right? But or advise on them. But I think it's still a very valid point. So Joshua, from your perspective, you may be early on, right, for thinking about these things, but you're probably going to sit down.
Certainly we're looking at. Yeah, I think interestingly, it's more of a natural selection based on geography. And Europe specifically, founders can't just be focused on Germany, for example. It's a fractured market, and they have to, yes, a number of companies we're looking at aren't even doing their apps that are releasing in Germany in German. They're doing it all in English because they know they have to be able to scale, to go to other countries quickly. And so it's more of a thinking of, okay, how are we going to be able to continue to learn at the same time, getting the data and the evidence that we need to prove that this model works, not just that we're able to spend half of our budget on ad buys, but actually acquire people the way that they should be acquired through efficacy of the products or services. Whereby in the US, and I'll say this as an American in Europe, the American ego is such that I want mine, all of it. It's the part of the story. And so I think it's just part and parcel of being that the biggest dog in the dog park, to be able to not have to necessarily think of innovative ways, because of the market in America is so huge. You just keep going doing the same thing. There's no incentive or necessarily demand to change up your business model. That's what I would suspect.
Thanks, Joshua. And I realize I've been ignoring a question from Naomi here again. And Naomi, by the way, everybody, I'm mentioning Naomi by name because she's one of our partners and was involved in the meeting in Lisbon and runs the Applied Neuroscience Association. So thanks, Naomi. She points out that what many people don't realize is that at least 40% of Alzheimer's dementia is preventable, a Lancet study in 2020. And while pharma solutions may be a while off, which is true, other digital interventions can be very impactful. And I want to stress this goes beyond neurodegeneration, right? If we look at mental health, we're seeing digital tech companies out there using voice analysis software to detect when somebody may need to check in with their psychiatrist because their symptoms may be increasing. And this, of course, applies to neurodegeneration as well. But we're literally seeing technology where voice recognition can diagnose a greater likelihood of depression or bipolar or something else, right? So the question here is, what do investors look for when considering funding innovations which address key modifiers like depression, stress, exercise, measuring cognition and cognitive training, sleep, etc.? And I think that's a tricky one because there are wonderful general digital health things out there like the Apple, the Apple Watch and the Oura Ring and all sorts of other wearables, right? But then there are the truly clinical ones like Cambridge Cognition, which are used primarily for clinical trials, including obviously for pharmaceuticals. But what do you look at in terms of the business model, the investment case when you're funding innovations which may prevent a condition, which is it more B2C than those that are focused on treating a condition? Because the economics apply differently, right? There is, of course, a massive savings when somebody does not get sick versus when they do, depending on the specific disease or condition. But how are you looking at that? And is there a preference in certain funds for treating existing diseases versus treating the factors which can increase risk of disease? Or if we look back to the migraine story I was involved in, the conditions which can trigger an acute attack of a chronic disease, for example. That's a hard one.
I just feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'll let somebody else say something.
So we've got a follow-up from Naomi on this, and she says, for example, emerging technology to use retinal scans as a biomarker for Alzheimer's, or neurofeedback, the potential for biomarkers and also for intervention. I mean, neurofeedback, we could increase that to neurostimulation, right? With the to treat or to prevent Alzheimer's, for example, so we get into a lot of different potential indications here. When you're looking at, let me go to Karl, and then we'll come back to both of the investors. Karl, when you see a company which is saying, we have a test to determine risk of Alzheimer's, right? And where you stand in terms of your risk. We have a diagnostic approved. It has a CE mark. We're looking at coming to the US. This is a case in point, an actual company I'm thinking of. They need to raise money. They haven't raised much, although they are on the market in a few countries in Europe. How do you look at that versus one that says we're developing a treatment for Alzheimer's? In terms of the funding, are there different sets of, this is all digital and technology, right? We're not talking biopharma. We're talking neuro, digital, AI, neurotech, et cetera. How do you look at their strategy and the questions around the funding versus one that's developing a therapeutic?
Sure. I think one of the major drivers of decision making comes to what's the business model and who's going to pay for it, right? So in the case of a diagnostic test, unfortunately, payers in at least the United States are pretty far behind the curve, right, in being willing to pay for diagnostic tests, because they'll, in many cases, they feel that will open up to additional treatment costs, and those links to prevention are sometimes, you know, maybe they are solid, very solid, and there is a very specific use case and an expected set of outcomes, and maybe there's not. And so I think they tend to think more broadly about diagnostics as there's not. And so that's an issue. Who pays for that? So is it the consumer is expected to pay? Is it something that a self-insured employer might pick up? And that would be on a one-off, you know, one-by-one use case where you're contracting with individual employers. And those contracts might look differently than, you know, subsequently from each other. And so there's all these subtleties and nuances that are involved. But again, it comes down to who will be willing to pay for it. And on the therapeutic side, that pathway and that kind of outcome, if you will, is a little more established than it is on the digital side, you know, today, right? So we have a 100+ you know, business year model, 100+ year old business model versus one that's let's say 15, you know, 20 years at the max. And so those things are still playing out, I think, globally. And, you know, we have a way to get reimbursement for digital therapeutics, for example, in Germany now. But, you know, at least initially there was concern that those reimbursement rates were fairly low. And, you know, is there money still to be made? And is still margin possible, you know, in an environment like that? So there's a whole range of issues, but again, it comes down to who's willing to pay for it. And that goes to the business model and the soundness of it. And then kind of, you know, what your plan is to maximize your penetration in any given TAM or total accessible market.
So, I mean, that's very interesting, because it comes down to not only the diagnostic and the reimbursement, but then if people want to take measures or use an app or a tool or a device which reduces their risk, especially for those, for example, who found out, let's think of Chris Hemsworth, right? Just found out he's at much higher risk of Alzheimer's and dementia than the average population. There are all sorts of behavioral strategies, as well as existing digital health solutions and technology solutions that can help you reduce your risk, mostly behavioral, but not entirely, right? There are some others. Does this become a pure sort of B2C where the onus is on the consumer to improve their lifestyle, sort of the way, you know, some insurers in the US, where insurance is very expensive, give a discount for gym membership and participation, right? But basically the onus is on the consumer if they want to go to a gym and train and eat a healthy diet or not. This is maybe a question that goes beyond how do we solve that. It's not a question for an investor panel, but it is a question around how do we invest and how do we fund these things? Because some of these solutions may be something which it's going to be very hard to get reimbursement for, or get you know, to get buy-in from major self-insured employers or health systems. But there may be a consumer market for it. There may then be a health equity gap, and not only the informed patients or consumers with the economic resources can use these tools, but there is a market there for some of them. And this can be video games for children with learning disorders or depression. They can be tools for elderly people with Alzheimer's. They can be physical therapy tools, which are digital for rehabilitation. We're going to have a keynote from John Krakauer, the Chief Medical Officer of MindMaze, and he's a KOL neurologist and psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, on Thursday morning, about digital rehabilitation for stroke patients. as an alternative care journey, by the way, with improved outcomes, right? Versus the existing care journey, which John will argue is broken, right? Now that is one where somebody's already had a stroke. What about something that takes an at-risk patient and reduces the chance of having a stroke? So this is diagnosis plus prevention. It's very tricky. Yulia?
Yeah, I think I can speak of, so far we see like all of this market is quite fragmented. So we either have to look at digital or new hardware, or we have to look at diagnostics or prevention, or we look at therapeutics. But I think the future, and especially if we're in deep tech, we have to think about the future a lot. We have to envision what we would see the world in 20 years or 30 years from now, and where the whole technological world will stand for, how we live the life. And I would say one of the ideas that we have is we're not going to have these fragmented markets where we look either at diagnostics or prevention or therapeutics. The world around us is rapidly digitalizing, and we have more and more smart devices around us. So far, they are not capable to produce enough relevant data, but we already have a next generation of technologies, wearables technologies, who would have necessary data, but not only data, they will be able to read data, have a layer of software that will produce therapeutics, prevention therapeutics, and that will be, I think we'll live in a world where we have all of this together, merged together. We will have more diagnostic devices around us as well. And I don't know if you heard about the concept of digitalizing sensors or digitalizing olfactories, where we can have a better sensors around us that will potentially also lead to better diagnostics on a daily basis in-house, like in households. So I would say that looking like much forward, we may have this, we may already see that in the early stages, where we may have certain devices, especially in the brain-machine interface wearables, where we not only have devices that take that read out data and provide certain insights from this data, but they're also creating the whole therapeutics around this.
Okay, yeah, so I think taking a mid to long-term view, the perspective, the opportunity becomes much more interesting. So thanks for that. I want to ask Joshua a question on this line, and then I want to sort of switch and get into some final questions to each of you, which will be a little bit in terms of, you know, what you're funding, what you want entrepreneurs to know, Karl, you know, who you're looking to advise, what you would like to have them in mind when they're looking at the fundraising or the M&A process, et cetera, business model side. But Joshua, I think I want to take this one to you, because on the digital health side, for mental health and also digital delivery of care, which can be cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a lot of scope for different approaches, right? From pure telemedicine to brain stimulation to neuromodulation to virtual reality to gamification of therapies, et cetera. Some of these are treatments, some of these are prevention, and some of them are essentially both, right? They're not in one category. So, you know, how do you look at this? And from a mental health and wellness side, one of the things I've looked at for years, and I think some of the audience will know, I have some. I would be less disappointed if some of the big players on the mental wellness side in digital health, the big apps, and I'm not going to name them, but there are several with several hundred million in annual, you know, revenues. They don't really do anything beyond digital delivery of yoga and meditation, which is great, by the way, but they now have the resources, the capacity, and the distribution channels to do something more, which really affects patients where there is a real need. Because wellness is great, but there's also illness which we could treat, right? And there are real disorders and conditions. So I would like to see them do more, but then I'm going to ask you, as a mental health and wellness impact investor, would you come down equally where you're looking at sort of the therapeutic and the treatment side versus the prevention side? Is it a sliding scale, or are you seeing, a lot of your investments are doing both?
Yeah, I think it's the entire range. And I think that's for us as an impact fund where we're looking at maximizing the number of people with increased mental wellness. So going from mental illness to being able to cope a bit better is also a win for us. And I think for us also as an impact fund and being tied to the social outcomes that we measure, we are looking to invest in founders specifically that not only have a robust theory of change, how the approaches that they're doing, the activities, the inputs lead stepwise to the outcomes, long-term outcomes and then impact, but also that they're driven by the data and the evidence, not just that they have, sure that they are drawing on information and data that exists out there in the general corpus of knowledge. Also that they're actively either doing either their own studies, their own RCTs, or that they're committed to being also driven by that impact. Because then we get to the point where we have these huge companies that, to your comments, are doing little more than being content delivery mechanisms, which is great, but that's not getting us to where we need to. That's not, the delta in change isn't there. Those specific companies, I would not have invested in them because they didn't have the robustness of information at the point when they were getting started at their pre-seed and seed stage. And so we would have gone back and said, actually, can you bolster this a little bit? What are the studies? How do you know this is going to work? And what's the change you're looking to maximize? And so that's how we're looking at this question of data input impact. And that also goes to Naomi's, one of the earlier questions around, just one of the earlier questions. We were all here, we heard it. I don't have to repeat it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. That's really interesting. And it sort of illustrates something that I saw recently. There was a company, I'm not going to talk about the exact indication, but they're working on a digital therapeutic, right? But they also have, in the meantime, and it's a potentially very nice digital therapeutic, but they also have a B2C side, which they're selling now, which generates revenues. And I watched a pitch, really nice polished pitch from the CEO. And he explained, we're doing this, but we don't have to wait for that. We're making money now. Right. And I can see that going over really well with some investors. But in the room where he did it, it was a room full of health investors. And it really sort of fell flat because they didn't care about making money now with the B2C. They're only interested in the therapeutic, right? And I think, what you're saying there, like these big companies, they're great. I don't want to criticize them. It would just be really nice to see them take their position and capabilities and do something beyond what they're doing now, right? Maybe just investing in your funds, by the way, right? I mean, you guys could allocate that money. So I think there are win-win solutions here. Maybe Karl, you can help broker that. That could be a follow-up over a few glasses of wine the next time we're all together. But we have another question here. I wasn't going to ask it. I wanted to get on to what are you investing? How are you advising? What would you recommend to founders and CEOs? But this is a good question from Jenny. And she writes, mental health science is on the cusp of transformative change. Due to less fundamental biology knowledge, pharmacotherapies and psychotherapies have limited efficacy. Neuromodulation is a promising technology using different types of stimulations, such as magnetic stimulation, current stimulation, and optical stimulation to change connectivity and may affect at a cellular level, changing plasticities through the expression of various genes. That's the background. So the question is—
I'll add a acoustic to that as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And we've seen some great companies in that space, right? When considering funding innovations that improve neuromodulation research and application, what do investors look for? If you guys want to read that, you can see it in the Q&A. You should each be able to see it because it's a long one. But really, what do investors look for when funding innovations that improve neuromodulation?
I may take, we have like—
I know you've done some investments in this space, Julia, so you're a good one to take it.
Yeah, we love neuromodulation, and we look at the whole space and every single technology that appeared there. So whether that's possible to change neuroplasticity, yeah, there've been a lot of research in this space already, and there is a great potential. And the whole neurostimulation for not just brain health, but the whole, that may potentially change the whole bioelectric medicine space as well, because we're now starting to explore various therapies that were not available before. Different groups like Gavan Bioelectronics and GSK, and there are a couple of venture labs in the UK working on new forms of bioelectric medicine. So taking the brain only, it's a great unexplored area, and we now see the first generation of companies such as BlackRock, Neuralink, Precision Neuroscience, and Cron starting with the first applications, but we also see the next generation of companies starting there as well. So I would say it really depends on the investor level and what stage of companies they're looking for. We are specifically looking for next generation companies, so we look for more miniaturization in devices that will allow us to unlock more therapies. And as I mentioned, we look at wireless power delivery or new forms of delivery of brain-mesh interfaces. We also look at biological approach to brain-mesh interfaces. So it's optogenetics, and that's huge, but also an explored area. So I would say it really depends on the investors. But and you also can break it into therapies and devices itself. So there are certain investors who interested specifically in therapies and those specific applications, and those who are looking at devices itself, like we are interested in devices.
Okay, so, and thank you, Julia, because that was a perfect segue into the questions I wanted to ask before Jenny's very nice question came up. So we now have a sense of where you're investing. I think that's become pretty clear. Do you have a geographic scope? Is it Europe, North America, global? And what is a typical deal size for you? I know you're doing seed and Series A, but can you tell us a little bit about geographic focus or limitations, if any, and then sort of deal size and round preference, just so if somebody's doing a $500,000 raise, should they look to you, and if they're doing a 10 million raise, should they look to you or not, that sort of thing.
That's a great question. We support companies all the way from their spin-off from universities. So we'll have companies, we'll have to do the first check. And we'll have pre-seeds, we'll have stealth companies. We usually do checks for, as a first check, we do up to 500K, and each geographically agnostic. So we look at US, Europe, and the rest of the world.
Okay, fantastic. Joshua, same question to you. I'm guessing Europe specifically and Germany, obviously, because you're there and you're seeing all the deal flow, right? But you're doing
Sure.
seed, you're doing early stage. What is deal size likely to be for you? And
Right, so likely for us is at the seed stage 450 to 500,000 euros.
okay,
Pre-seed up to 100, and then we'll do a few Series A as well. But
Okay.
primarily Europe, and that's correct. That's very important.
yeah, and those Series A's, will that more likely be follow on of some of your investments where there's real
As
potential
well.
and you
Right.
want to avoid the dilution as they go forward?
Sure, that's certainly the case. But we see that there are a couple of companies that have to be Series A or Series A now that they're still early enough, because a European Series A is different than American Series A.
Yeah.
That it makes sense for us to come in as an early stage investor.
Okay, thanks a lot. And Karl, you're dealing with clients of different sizes, but if we're looking at private companies, let's say from the seed, Series A, B, C, M&A, where are your, and in the neuro space, right? Because I understand it may be different from when you're advising another company. where do your clients tend to be, across the board, or are you looking at clients that have already done, you know, a 10 or 20 million plus Series A or B, or are you working with, you know, you're in Boston, really innovative early stage companies as well? Just tell us a little bit about, you know, when and where you engage with companies and when it makes sense for them to contact you.
Sure. So to describe that a little bit, we do see a range, and we work with a range in terms of our clients, and that varies, as you can imagine, between, let's say, more traditionally healthcare and more traditionally life sciences, because their funding needs and strategic objectives and milestones are all different, right? So that's part of the complexity. But typically speaking, we work with companies that are, you know, probably on the cusp of doing a transaction with a kind of a minimum or floor of 20 million US dollars. And so we typically work with, you know, a company when they've reached that level, and that whether that's a fundraising round or whether that's potential M&A, you know, sell side, even buy side. So those are kind of our loose metrics, but we are flexible, and we do run across, you know, sometimes it's even pre-revenue as an early stage, and sometimes in a few cases we've worked with some public companies as well. So it varies dramatically.
Okay, sounds good. So guys, I promised you an hour to an hour and a half. We're at an hour and 20 minutes. I'd like to leave it with a final comment or recommendation from each of you, and I don't want to be too prescriptive. Let's assume that 60–70% of the audience, those who are watching now and those who will watch the recorded version on Biotechgate, because this will be up for the, you know, for the duration of the weekend, I believe after the conference as well. What would your recommendation be to founders of early stage companies, whether could be pre-formation, they're still at a university, could be, you know, a group of entrepreneurs putting something together, they could have already raised their seed and now they're looking for a real Series A. What would you want them to keep in mind? It could be about approaching you and how you're investing. It could be just about how they go about, you know, building their business model, their strategy, and approaching the fundraising. So it could be more general advice. But what would you like them to have in mind? And this could be something that you feel is, you know, not sufficiently prioritized, or founders don't tend to be well enough aware of, or it could be just good general advice you've given 100 times. But what's the message you'd like to leave them?
I can start. I would say, especially in a pre-seed, and especially for someone, especially for scientists taking innovation out of university, try to find complementary expertise, because doing startups is as much doing business, building business both internally by getting team, selling the whole idea to a team, to building culture, as growing externally as well. So think of this as doing business, not just innovating the space, and try to take this complementary expertise within a team to look at the whole company from different angles.
Thanks a lot, Julia, and thank you for going first on so many of the questions. I appreciate it. Somebody always has to step forward. Jonathan or Joshua or Karl, pardon me. Sorry, Joshua. I just had an email popping up from a Jonathan at the same time.
Jonathan's out there. To follow up on Julia's point, I think it's also crucial that you as the founder take a hard look at what is the core reason you're doing this right now, given all the things you could be doing in the world. The life of an entrepreneur, of a founder, is a roller coaster that has 75 different loops and death valleys and a whole bunch of things that can be at times quite treacherous and also detrimental to your own mental health. And so if you haven't taken a look at your deep why, not only that of yours or your co-founders, and really try to identify what are the blind spots in your leadership style, because you might be the most brilliant scientist. Are you the best leader? And to that effect, I think it's also crucial to look at yourself of where do you want to be in relation to this company in 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? Are you a serial startup founder? Are you one that can transform over time and not just be a startup founder, but a CEO? Those are two fundamentally different things. Because if not, and if you're not willing to admit that to yourself, there's a great chance that your ego is going to get in the way of any progression and not allow you to take the right step for both yourself and the company that you founded.
Thank you, Joshua. That's really good advice. I appreciate it. And you also hit on something that reminded me of something. When you mention the entrepreneur journey, and it is tough and it can be challenging for their own mental health, you made me think for the second time in this call of a very cool company, and I'm not going to name them, but they're targeting specifically acoustic neuromodulation for entrepreneurs and leaders who are having some mental health challenges. And Karl, you mentioned the acoustic neuromodulation. Really cool company. I'm not going to plug them during the event, but if you want to know who they are and get in touch, just reach out. There are a bunch of very cool companies, and some of them are in the audience today, and some others Julia mentioned. We're seeing really amazing things, and I think this space is really hot, and I want to keep watching it and supporting it. Karl, I guess last word goes to you, and we'll wrap up today.
Well, I think coincidentally enough, and maybe the great minds thing is applicable here. I'm not going to say that for sure definitively, but I think the three pieces of advice are all kind of related. And so my piece of advice is that seed, pre-seed is very important that a company is able to focus and stays focused on that current and hopefully primary and hopefully potentially most successful use case when going to market. But when you get close to Series A and subsequent rounds, we often find that the life of a CEO and entrepreneur being very difficult, and having many pulls in many different directions. But it's important that you, at some point, take that jump from kind of the insular focus to the external focus. And so you find out what your competitors are doing and who are your competitors, and particularly in an area that's as complex as this one, where all the entrants are coming from different angles. Seek help. If this is something you can't do on your own, you need to educate yourself and be aware of what else is going on in the space. And so when you have those slides you throw up in your pitch deck, this is our competition. I almost never see a company getting that right the first time out of the gate. They're always leaving some significant players off the table. And so that's that external focus. So at some point you have to develop that. This goes back to what Julia said earlier. Small companies don't have the wherewithal and the finances to hire a corporate development team, right? And so who traditionally some of this work would go towards. And so that's another aspect. When you get large enough, think about that, or seek help from some external party.
Thank you, Karl. Also really good advice. So I want to thank the panel, but before I do that, I want to just say to the audience, I see we've lost a few of you in the last minutes. We have sessions tomorrow, Wednesday, and Thursday, continuing on the neuro, digital health, and digital health for mental health theme. So please join in, take a look at the program online, and if you'd like to get engaged, do get engaged. For those of you that asked questions that we didn't answer, I hope you can join us, including the speakers here next October in Lisbon. As Joshua said, we had a great venue, a really interesting meeting. I think my favorite quote from one of the CEOs was, "This meeting is special," and it was an interesting meeting, a lot of fun. We'll do that again. We'll do a related one in this space on brain capital and education technology in the San Francisco Bay Area end of June. So I hope to see all of our speakers at either or both of those. I hope to see all of our participants there. I'd like to thank again Biotechgate and all of our partners, the European Brain Council, the Champalimaud Foundation, Medable and Cambridge Cognition, and our other partners for their support. And join us the rest of the week. For those of you in the biopharma space, we'll have an event in Europe, and in the psychedelic therapeutic space, we'll have an event in Texas next year. We'll launch the announcements for all of those in January, but we're trying to put together a series of events where we're talking to key stakeholders in different but related spaces to provide some networking and access beyond what you might usually find. And I realize if you're pure biopharma, you may not come to the meeting on neurodigital and AI, although we did dive in deeply into precision medicine and drug development for biopharmaceuticals on the psychiatry side, as well as on the CNS side. So maybe you should look a little bit more broadly, see who else is out there, and engage in smaller, very high-level meetings. And that's it for this week. I hope you're using the partnering and connecting with some of the 1,200 plus participants Biotechgate has brought together from around the world. They're not all in digital health, but plenty of them are. So thank you, Yulia, Joshua, Karl. Have a great day. Thanks for joining in at short notice. A really nice session, and I look forward to seeing you all, hopefully in person sometime soon. And we'll have an even more interactive event then. Thanks, everyone.